Hello, this is Angelia, and you are listening to or watching the podcast, Why You Do What You Do. The podcast talks about human development and psychology to maybe help you figure out a little bit more about why you do what you do. And we were talking about intelligence tests and looking at the mental age, and we're going to take back up on that. To determine the mental age, each person is given a series of age-related, age-graded tests to perform. For each test passed successfully, the person earns 1 month toward the mental age. The total number of months is compiled at the end, and the true figure is used to get the IQ's mental age. So, this is good in determining, if your child is behind a little bit, or if your kid is a lot smarter and needs to be like Doogie Howser and bump up a few. The Wechsler Intelligence Scales. David Wechsler, who developed the scales, believed that intelligence was related to the ability to cope with and adapt to the environment. And it is survival of the fittest. But not only the physically fittest, the mentally fittest as well. Because you're going to present with a lot of problems in life. Life is not easy. We all know that. And you're going to have to be able to think. And that's why women, they believe, evolved to have 3 times the connection in their corpus callosum as men. Because men were, larger and they could fight and, things like that. And women, we were the child bearers. We were built for that. And if trouble came, a woman would have to be able to think quick. Because she's not going to be able to beat up the men coming at her, usually. There's some Amazons out there, I guess, but, most of us are smaller than the men. And, we can fight, but even with skilled fighting, we might not always be able to overcome a physically larger foe. So, they think that women were then adapting to thinking a little quicker, to have the emotional side of our brain and the logical side of our brain talking to each other a little faster, so we could figure out where we need to go, where could we run, what could we do, to save our future generations. So, being able to be thinking on your feet, and process quickly, behooved women to save their children from marauding, tribes that were coming against their tribe. So, his selection of test items reflects this approach. The several scales have also been revised to keep more current with cultural changes, because as we know, the culture changes. It's like I tell my kids, this is not the USA I grew up in. This is a completely different one, and it's a little scary. Back in my day, when I was coming up, we were preaching, love thy neighbor, and, all of us, inclusion, and, it was a much happier, better world, in my opinion. And now things are a little different. We're like, what the bleep is going on here? Because this ain't my world. But, and are therefore considered by many clinicians to yield more valid scores, because the test is adapting as the world adapts, which, unfortunately, is a thing. In addition, the fact that there are separate scales for different age groups makes them very popular, because, that way, you have more options. As mentioned previously, there are 4 scales. The first one is the Wechsler Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence, and that's for children 4 to 6.5. Generally speaking, you cannot test a child 3 and under, because they're not going to pay that much attention. They can't keep the focus that long. They don't always tell the truth. And most clinicians will not touch a child 3 and under. They'll see them, they'll talk to them, and they might do some play therapy and stuff, but they're not going to be testing them or getting into anything that deep, because the children are just not capable of doing that at this point. Number 2, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children, revised for children 7 to 16. And that's what most of your kids, if you get them tested in school or in a psychologist's office, most of them are going to take that test. The Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale revised for adults 17 to 65. And most people consider, an adult at 17 as far as psychology goes, because you're in your senior year of high school, you're getting ready to go out into the world. So essentially, you are an adult. You're starting to have adult responsibilities, so you're starting to think like an adult. You won't be fully capable of critical thinking till you're between ages of 21 and 23 usually. So, that's a whole deal. The Wechsler Intelligence Scale for the elderly for adults over 65. Like I say, your older folks, their mind might start slipping a little bit, and they might decide they want to get tested. Or, they might be incompetent and they may need to get tested to decide, where exactly they are. In the WAIS-R, there are elements subtests, 6 that evaluate verbal skills, and 5 that measure performance at problem-solving tasks. Now, I would probably have some problems with the verbal skills because, like I said, that's why I got a thesaurus and I read that sucker because my brain just couldn't come up with, words sometimes that it wanted to use. And I know that's from my stroke I had. So, I think of other words that I can use, and that's helped me, rather than sit there and just say, for 5 minutes till the word comes, Now, problem-solving tasks, I've always been good at those, even from a little kid when they give you the little ball, you can put all the little shapes in it, and, I've always been good at solving problems. 3 different IQs, verbal performance, and full total score scale are then obtained. So they're taking a look at, the person as a whole and what they're capable of and what they're not capable of. In addition, the pattern of the subtest scores often indicates the presence of organic or other impairments. Because sometimes that's the thing. I have 2 sons who were in ECE classes, and one son who has Asperger's. So, they have impairments. They can be hereditary. I know that I had an uncle and a cousin who had, these things. And then on my husband's side of the family, he has a mother and, his nephews have some problems. And he has another cousin who's very mentally disabled. So these things run in families and they can happen, and sometimes it's not a mental thing, it's an organic thing. In general, this is the case when the person scores strikingly better on the verbal tests than on the performance tests. And now 2 of my sons had this problem. Performance IQ, one of them had the performance IQ of like 122, but his, I'm sorry, I said the verbal of 122, and then the performance IQ was down in the 80s. So, that says there's a problem there, that's up here, but it can't get out here. And then another one of my sons had the same thing. There was a big gap in his, language and performance IQ. So that is indicative of a problem when that shows up. And usually you already know the kid might be hyper, distractible, or can't, literally just can't do the work. And that's when, there's a problem there. And it's a good thing, to get the kid tested and figure out what is the problem, because with one of my sons, we found out he had ADD. He didn't have ADHD. He wasn't hyper, and all that stuff. He just focus issues. He could not pay attention. Every little thing. He was so distractible. And my other son, that was an ECE, he has dysgraphia. They call it specific learning disability. They don't like to put those labels, but the psychologist told me dysgraphia. He not only turned words backwards, like in dyslexia, but he turned them upside down, so it's really hard for him to read, but he enjoys it, he does it, and he's, upped his IQ scores to where he's like at 128, so that's really good. I'm proud of him for continuing, even though it's hard for him, because that's what a lot of people do. If it gets a little hard for you, no, I'm done. But that's not good. That's quitting, and you don't want to quit. You want to keep learning, keep doing. Never stop. I think there's a commercial, never stop learning. An inability to remember number sequences, for instance, may indicate damage to the temporal lobe of the brain. They measure the person's ability to succeed within the educational and social systems of the culture that devised the test. A person who is seldom exposed to the norms and values of that culture will almost certainly obtain a poor rating. And that's with your problems. If you took a guy out of the bush, from overseas, and he knew everything and was really smart for his world, and then you brought him in this one and asked him these questions on these tests, he's probably not going to have the answers. He's probably not going to know. And that's not because he's dumb. That's because he has not been exposed to this culture. Because, out there in the bush, he has to know how to trap and, get food and get water and stuff like that. And if he's not watching, our television or listening to our radio or getting our newspapers, he doesn't know what's going on, so sometimes these tests are not going to work, for people who come from a culture that was not exposed to our culture. So most psychologists agree with this criticism, at least to some extent, and a lot of time and energy have been spent on trying to formulate a test that has no cultural bias. And, I think they're still working on that. Because, it's biased towards the clinicians who made the test with the questions of things that they felt like a general person should know. But a general person here in the United States or in Germany or England, wherever the test came from. So, again, all things are relative, and one size doesn't always fit all. Still, the concept of IQ has taken firm hold. As proof, despite their inherent deficits, intelligence tests are still widely used to distinguish children who are mentally disabled and those who are gifted, so that they can be placed in classes geared to their special needs. And that's, not necessarily a bad thing anyway, because if you are living here and your child is going to have to live here and succeed in school here and move on to a successful life here, then they need to be in the same place where their peers are, or they're going to be left behind. Sometimes kids from a different culture might have to go into a little bit of ECE, and it's not because they're mentally disabled, it's because they have not been exposed to the culture, and they need to play catch up. They are also used for generally evaluating the intellectual level of the person being assessed in the intake interview. If you come in and the clinician is sitting there listening to you and everything, and some of your ideas are off and wonky, and they might just be sitting there and they're not going to say this, but they might be thinking, wow, you're as dumb as a box of rocks. They might think, well, let's do this test. And if that comes out the case, they're like, okay, so this person, got some problems. We're going to do as best we can. We might need to go back and do this like for someone younger, so again, you have to be able to help your client where they're at, the psychologist finds you where you're at, kind of like, the saying about Jesus finding you where you're at, psychologists find you where you're at too. They can't fast forward you or mentally age you or raise your IQ. They find you where you're at, and then they have to bring you up to where, you want to be. So, and a good life coach to do that too. Tests for neurological impairment. Many behavioral symptoms are produced by organic problems in the brain. And that's the case, with my children. They did a EEG and ECG on my oldest child to see and saw the abnormalities in it and said, okay, this looks like a lot of the folks who got ADD. So this is probably what's going on. You're telling me he's distractible. He, has problems staying on task and is, wiggling around a lot. So this is probably what's going on. And like I say with my other one, the evidence was obvious because, he was telling me and the teachers, sometimes stuff looks different to me. And that's the best he could describe it as. Like, if I look long enough, I see that's a B. But sometimes when I look at it, it doesn't look like that. It looks like it's a D, and then sometimes it looks like a P. So they're like, oh, So, sometimes it's obvious. And then the behaviors my middle one was showing by the time he was, a toddler. The doctor said, hey, this is symptoms of autism. He doesn't have them all, but he has these. So this is called Asperger's when you don't, go all the way, but you're at this level, and that's what he has. And of course, that doctor was wrong when he said we might have to put him, in a home later on. There might be more problems later on. He was the most social kid I had, and he has pretty much worked to overcome all his, problems that he has had. So, I'm proud of all my kids. All my kids have done the best they could and overcome their disabilities, and that's what everyone should do. I don't like, I know it's hard for everybody. I got disabilities. Everybody does. But me and my husband and my kids, we're fighters, and we're going to overcome what we can overcome. So, my husband had a heart episode, and he had a lung operation. He's back up on his feet, going to work. He's doing stuff. He's not going to give up and quit because of stuff. And I'm not going to either. I'm sitting here doing the best I can do. So, I just feel sorry for the people who are in the woe is me. And so they feel like they can't do what they could do, and so they don't do anything. And then they vegetate, and, what happens when you sit long enough, you pass away. And that's a shame. But there are people that's it. They give up, and, they're not interested in overcoming. They just feel so sorry for themselves. Woe is me. And they just give up on life, and that's a shame. Therefore, a clinician must sometimes verify that the problem is indeed psychological. While there are several medical terms and tests that can do this, there are also some psychological methods of determining this fact. One of the most valuable is the Halstead-Reitan Neuropsychological Battery. Say that 3 times fast. Which can identify difficulties in auditory and visual perception, in motor skills, and in abstracting ability. For instance, the client may be asked to do the following. And now, my oldest son, he had problems with that. He had the static tonic neck reflex thing. They got him a little seat to sit on in his chair, and he went to physical therapy, at the school, and they had him doing different things and rolling on what was like a board and stuff. I feel like they did really great with him. There are ignorant people who decide that, if you just tried harder, if you just worked better, it would be better for you. You could do things. And they're just ignorant because they don't realize, that people do have physical and psychological problems that aren't going to be cured by just trying harder. So that's something we had to deal with, but we did. They need to differentiate between rhythmic beats that are sometimes the same and sometimes different for auditory perception. Now, my husband jokes that he has no rhythm at all. He says, I'm definitely a white man, and that's a joke that, white people don't have rhythm, but they do. But when he jokes about that, because he says he dances like Frankenstein, because he can't feel any beat. He don't have no rhythm. Number 2, fit a variety of blocks into a foam board or feel while blindfolded for visual perception. And that's one of the things, like I said, the block test, I love those. I was always good at those, and so, that's not one of my problems. Tap with the index finger as frequently as possible in the space of 10 seconds for motor skills. And, I've not heard of that one, but, that makes sense, I guess. Group items by specific characteristics, such as shape, color, or size for abstracting ability. And they do that a lot with kids. Put all the blue things here. Put all the square things here. And if there's a thing that's square and blue, put them in the middle. And that's something that they do with kids to, see just exactly where there may be some problems. Another test for organic impairment is the Bender Visual Motor Gestalt test, developed by Loretta Bender. In this test, clients are asked to draw freehand a set of designs shown to them on cards. And now that's something they did with me. I remember doing that. I did it just fine. Using tests like these, a clinician can access brain functioning. Specific problems in reproducing the designs, such as turning a figure in another direction or being unable to draw a complex design, are suggestive of different kinds of brain impairments. And I copied it, as good as my little 8th grade hand could, so. Physiological examination. Sometimes a full medical exam is very helpful in diagnosis, because like I say, sometimes it's not psychological. Sometimes you have a physical impairment in your brain that can cause you problems in your thinking and behaving. Of primary importance in this kind of exam are the electroencephalogram. Like I said, they did one of those on my son, EEG. The electrocardiogram, EKG, they did that on my husband not that long ago after his heart episode. Blood pressure tests, muscle tension tests, and x-rays. An EEG is a graphic representation of brain wave activity. Like I said, when they did my son's, they compared it with other kids', I guess, and said, yeah, he's got, ADD. A normal pattern has certain known characteristics. The pattern of someone with epilepsy, for instance, looks quite different. Indeed, many forms of organic brain dysfunction cause such distorted patterns. Therefore, if a client's EEG is unusual, its pattern can be compared with those of other abnormal conditions to see which it most closely resembles. An EKG and blood pressure tests can determine the status of the person's autonomic nervous system, part of which is involved in creating anxiety. This is true also of muscle tension. The muscles can be checked by a similar polygraph hookup to see how tight they are. Now, in my opinion, that's all a polygraph would be good for, because most of us know that they're not accurate. Or a lie detector test is not accurate. If you have a stomach pain, that's going to register, and so whatever was going on, the question they asked when you had a stomach pain, it's going to say you lied because there was a reaction. If you step on, there was a thing about somebody taking a lie detector test where they had a tack in their shoe, and they kept pressing, the thing so that it stayed, the same. So there's ways to beat it, and like I said, if you suddenly have a sharp pain, it can say you're lying when you're not. So they're not good for anything but showing muscle tension. So if you're worried about somebody's anxiety level or whatever, that's actually, you know, a good, like if they give you a scenario saying, what if this happened? And you're like, oh, you know, then they know, okay, there's some serious tension, some anxiety there. And that's really all it's good for, you know, in my opinion. Because, like I said, that's what it registers. It's muscle tension and heart rate and things. And like I say, anything, somebody walks in the room, you see somebody you thought you knew walk by, it's going to register. So, you know, they really shouldn't be admissible, and that's why they're not admissible in a court. And, you know, there's just no use in giving them to people other than to see if a person has anxiety. The muscles can be checked, yes. X-rays can reveal gross internal injuries that may cause behavior problems. For example, a brain tumor can enlarge to the point where it presses on certain sensitive areas of the brain, thus causing momentary blackouts, loss of consciousness, impaired speech, or confused thinking. So, you know, if you feel like you're going crazy, maybe you should go to your doctor. Talk to your doctor and say, man, I just, you know, got all this stuff going on, and they can do a head x-ray. After I had a car accident, I had my head x-rayed, and yeah, there's a brain in there, and it's still kicking. So, you know, in those cases where the symptoms pattern is very similar to that of the known organic mental disorders, most clinicians will first request medical tests to rule out that possibility. So if the person seems like psychologically they're fine, but they got this stuff going on, they're going to say, you know what, go see your MD. You can get an x-ray, you can get an MRI, and they can have a better look of what's going on inside of you. Problems in assessment. The function of assessment is to accurately classify the presenting problem and to determine its severity. Only when the problem has been assessed can an appropriate management method be selected and a prognosis made. So, you have to tell the truth to your therapist. You have to allow them to do their job in order for you to get helped. Now, like I said, I've met some people, and there's some people who have some serious problems that they ain't really interested in getting help. They want attention. They want, you know, to get some attention because they didn't get any growing up, or it was a problem. And so this is where they're getting some, is they go to a therapist, and the therapist is trying to help them, and then they're blocking because they just want to keep coming. They don't want to get help. They just want to have this relationship where someone's paying them some attention and listening to them. And that's a shame, but that is a reality. By reviewing the client's responses to the interview questions and to whatever tests are administered, as well as the client's overall behavior during the session. Remember, like I said, your behavior tells things to folks if you know what to look for. The clinician accumulates a list of important problematic behaviors or inappropriate emotional attitudes from which the first diagnosis is made. And like I say, there are folks who exhibit behaviors that are problematic for themselves and others. Excuse me. And also, there are people who have inappropriate emotional attitudes. Like we were talking about somebody, me and my family, a while back, and we said this person's emotions are just out of control. They're way over the top. You know, like the reaction was just so far above what the thing that was being talked about was, that it was like, everybody was like, whoa! You know, yeah. And, you know, that's disturbing to most of us when you come across someone, you know, like my kids talk about the Karens and Kevins in the world. Yeah, some of that, you're just like, what is wrong with you? maladaptive behavior. Hello. You know. The way that the psychologist looks at these responses is very important. Often just as important as the responses themselves. Essentially, they can be viewed in one of three ways. Number one is an accurate sample of the person's overall behavior. Number two, as a correlate of other behaviors, because sometimes, like I said, people exhibit a certain behavior not because they have this thing, but because this other thing is going on, and as a coping or habit, they're doing this other thing. So that would be where it's a correlate of something else that's going on. Number three is a sign of some underlying personality characteristic. Some people have personality disorders. It's just a fact. They grew up a certain way, they learned to adapt a certain way, and they learned coping mechanisms that present a certain way. And sometimes that is not good, and you have a personality disorder. A good sign is people who are loners, people who are problematic people for other people. It's like I said, I had a client that it was always everyone else. Everyone else was mean to her, picked on her, but I knew some of the other folks, and so I was talking to him about it, like, well, no, because here, she did this, she came and did this, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, I can see where that would be a problematic behavior, and if someone did this and said this to me, then yeah, I would be like, excuse me, no, you did this, and this is why this was said or done. So sometimes people have personality disorders, and they don't understand that. They don't think that. They think, they have a right to be themselves, which everyone does. But when yourself is a problem for you and others, then that's a problem. The three ways require an increasing degree of interpretation on the part of the clinician, and that's why they go to all them years of school. The first one requiring the least, and the third one requiring the most. Because, it's easy to say, this is just this overall behavior, than it is to start digging into stuff and finding out, if there's correlations, and then to find, okay, well, this is a personality problem that came from this in their past, and now that's something that we can deal with. So if you have a good therapist, that's what they're going to do. They're going to dig in and figure out, what exactly went on, what's going on, and how do we now start taking steps to help you to heal and grow as a person and become a well-adjusted and not a maladjusted person. And that's where I'm going to leave you for today. I hope that helped you figure out maybe a little bit more about why you do what you do. Please like and share this educational program so we can spread it around the world. And that's what it is, an educational program. It's not designed to diagnose or treat any mental illnesses. If you feel like something in this podcast triggered you or is a problem in your life, then by all means, talk to your mental health professional. Thanks for watching. That's all for now. Until next time.